What dark part of history isn't talked about enough? Story 1. In Switzerland, we used to sell orphan children to farmers, where they had to do hard work. It was basically slavery and lasted until the 1970s. Similar stuff happened in Germany and Sweden as well. My grandpa was one of them. They weren't necessarily orphans, but often just from poor families who couldn't feed their children because of the economical situation. Grandpa was the only of 6 kids who couldn't grow up with his parents. While he had a relatively good living situation, it did mark him for life, and it often resurfaced in his last year when he got dementia. Story 2. The second century decline, that basically set in motion the fall of the Roman Empire, but also set the groundwork for the challenges faced by the Parthian Empire, Persia, the Han Dynasty, China, the Gupta Empire, India, and the Kushan Empire, Central Asia. Basically, the whole civilized world started to fall and forever change course during that era. Edit, for the people responding with, "Don't you mean 3rd century?" I wanted to add that I consider the 2nd century decline, starting with the Antonine Plague in 165 AD. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. I consider this the starting point because it not only decimated a good portion of the Roman population, but also because it heavily affected the Middle Eastern realm, such as the Parthians. It seems to me, at least, to go downhill from this point onwards for most empires at the time, even if the plague had nothing to do with it. Off-Krauss pinpointing an exact start for anything with a global mindset is hard, as not all places went through the same things everywhere and at the same time. For instance, the questionnaires have a valid point, as it is often called the 3rd century crisis, not the 2nd century decline. But I think the 3rd century crisis focuses only on the Roman Empire. Anyhows, it's a very interesting topic. Cheers, everyone. Story 3. The year 536 is considered the worst in history. There were a series of volcanic eruptions that blocked the sun that caused famine and droughts. The bubonic plague also started to take hold this year, which took out a 1/3 of the human population in Europe. I think you are referring to the Justinianic plague. Bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, happened around 800 years later. The Justinianic plague was horrible too, don't get me wrong, as it ended around half of Earth's population. Story 4. Mediterranean galley slavery seems like something an edgy, grimdark author cooked up. Yet it was the economic backbone for the Italian kingdom, Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Yeah, slavery was an ongoing atrocity for thousands of years, essentially treating a human being as an animal or machine. A lot of the stuff that we consider nice requires a lot of time and energy input to concentrate raw materials and move them around. If you pay full price for the effort involved, it isn't nice. But apparently people can fool themselves that it's okay if the ones who do the work aren't fully human and don't need to be paid. Then it's nice again. Story 5. My grandfather lived in eastern Poland in the 50s and has several stories about this, actually. By then, any captured German hideaway would face no legal punishment, but it was well understood that if they were caught, the people would punish them, and as long as it was non-deadly and not too obvious, the authorities would look the other way. Where he lived, at least, the attempts to find non-deadly but horrible punishments that don't leave a mark got pretty nasty. In particular, there were several who got caught, over the course of years, who were punished by being taken to a horse stable, being forced to stick their nose up to the horse's butt, practically touching it, and being tied up in that position all night, often for 10 days with breaks during the daytime. My grandpa was a rancher, and on about 4 or 5 occasions, they asked to use one of his horses for the person, so he got a first-hand view. He said it was quite horrific, to say the least, but he didn't feel too bad for them. Story 6. I think the Opium Wars in China against Western powers like Britain aren't spoken about enough. We often wonder why there's beef between the East and the West, but this crap goes way back. Britain was basically doing to China what the CIA was doing with crack in black neighborhoods, while also trying to carve out pieces of China for themselves and completely ignoring the decrees of the emperor at the time. Also, before anyone thinks I'm like a China apologist, it was a topic that I had to write a paper on in college using sources and first-hand accounts from the time. Britain did some evil crap back then. Some of the books, if you're interested, are The Opium War Through Chinese Eyes by Arthur Waley, Imperial Twilight by Stephen Platt, The Boxer Rebellion and the Great Game in China by David Silby, Story 7. Arab and Muslim History Under the Ottoman Empire, or what historians like to call them as the Islamic Dark Ages, a time marked by an authoritarian regressive rule by the Ottoman Sultan and Turks that spanned from Persia till Morocco, the neglect of art and history, the suppression of the printing press, and total neglect of every corner of the empire that wasn't in Anatolia. It wasn't until Napoleon invaded that things got a little better, but the Turkish nationalist control of the empire in the late stages and the attempts of Turkification, both culturally and demographically, were really bad, especially under Abdulhamid II and the following CUP regime. There is a saying, the Ottoman Sultan only cared for three: women, tea, and booze. A lot of people actually believe that Ottoman times were the best times for Muslims, mostly Westerners, and even some Islamists. But that's a view that can be easily fixed by throwing a couple books at their heads. They either pick it up and read or get scared away by it. Story 8, Convict Leasing. Almost everyone in the US learns about the horrors of slavery. Almost no schools teach about the horrors of post-slavery convict leasing. After the US Civil War ended, former slave states enacted so-called black codes, making many relatively mundane activities criminal offenses that were only enforced against black people. Those black inmates were then leased back to landowners to perform unpaid labor. Since the people leasing the prisoners had no equity in, the conditions were absolutely horrible, even compared to chattel slavery. In some years, as many as 25% of leased prisoners died. Story 9. Although the Great Famine in Ireland is well known, one of the main reasons why it was so bad is less well known. The government at the time believed that the market alone would solve all problems. After the failure of the potato crop in 1845, for the following 2 years, food aid flowed into Ireland. This response mitigated the worst of the famine. But then a new government was elected in Britain, and they immediately withdrew most of the food aid, believing that the invisible hand of the market would instead solve the problem. They believed that giving handouts to the Irish would only make things worse. So thousands then starved or died of exposure after being evicted from their meager homesteads, or died by disease in the hopelessly packed workhouses and the coffin ships to Canada and America. The final death toll was over 1,180,000 years on. The Irish population has yet to reach pre-famine levels. Here's how Charles Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary to the UK Treasury with responsibility for Ireland, put it: the real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. Here's what Charles Wood, Chancellor of the Exchequer, said: a want of food and employment is a calamity sent by Providence. Except through a purgatory of misery and starvation, I cannot see how Ireland is to emerge into a state of anything approaching to quiet and prosperity. They genuinely believed that withholding support to the most needy and promoting unfettered trade would solve the problem. 1 million people died, all the while food was being exported from Ireland. The Irish famine is a warning from history, and I don't think any lessons have been learned at all. Story 10, The Great Migration. In the early 20th century, blacks in the South faced severe exploitation. When factories in the North started developing, blacks began migrating north for better paying jobs and working conditions. This created a serious labor shortage in the South, and whites in the South resorted to lots of dirty tricks to keep the blacks from leaving. Police sometimes went to train stations. If any black man had a ticket to a northern city, the police would tear it up. Train stations near black communities were dismantled. Labor agents from the North were forbidden from advertising jobs in the North. Sometimes blacks were punished with violent retribution if the local whites learned that they were preparing to leave. The worst abuses happened in smaller towns where everyone knew each other and conspired to keep the blacks in place and down. Many blacks who managed to escape to the North first bought tickets to a nearby large town where the train station staff didn't care if they bought a ticket to a northern state. Story 11, under the doctrine of state atheism in the Soviet Union, there was a government-sponsored program of forced conversion to atheism conducted by communists. As a part of its anti-religious campaign, the Communist Party destroyed churches, mosques, and temples, ridiculed, harassed, incarcerated, and executed religious leaders, flooded the schools and media with anti-religious teachings, and introduced a belief system called scientific atheism, with its own rituals, promises, and proselytizers. Many priests were ended and imprisoned, and thousands of churches were closed. According to some sources, the total number of Christian ended under the Soviet regime, owing to their faith, has been estimated to range around 12 to 20 million. Story 12, perhaps not the absolute darkest, but obscure nonetheless, just based on how much I see and hear it talked about. The Tennessee Children's Home Society, run by social worker Georgia Tann, straight up took, stole, bought, and sold hundreds of children. In effect, a child taking a scheme in plain sight. Many of the children weren't even orphans. Tan very often took advantage of desperate parents who were told that the home was basically a longer-term babysitting service or shelter to take care of the children until their parents could get back on their feet. Parents would come to collect their kids, only to be informed that their children had been adopted out or sold. These families had very little to no legal recourse due to naively signing binding documents from Tan and having no money or resources to fight back. It was not uncommon for these kids to grow into adulthood or die without ever knowing what happened to their biological families. There have been a couple of books written about it. Absolutely heartbreaking but fascinating stuff. Story 13 in the US. How the white people treated the Native Americans is downplayed quite a bit. I went to a school where there were more Native Americans than others, and the histories passed down are heartbreaking and angering to say the least. We also downplay slavery, which was a lot worse than taught. We almost never mention the other immigrants who built this country and infrastructure, such as the Irish and Asians. And we whitewash history to the point that Christopher Columbus is still taught as a hero, not genocidal fame seeker who died in a Spanish jail, and gloss over the fact that the Pilgrims wiped out entire tribes. I am Lebanese. My kin came over in the late 1800s, early 1900s. To others, since my skin isn't a dark brown, I'm considered white. I was raised by a black family on the wrong side of town. I would rather take in an immigrant than the typical white American at this. I am also a veteran. Story 14, the Heian period of Japan, and how it was anything but peaceful. Sure, there were no major wars, and there was certainly a boom in cultural development, but life was only good in the capital. The rest of the country was in complete chaos. By 1000 AD, the financial system collapsed, and the economy reverted to a barter system. Famines became widespread, and crime became rampant, to the point where the samurai clans had to step in to maintain some modicum of order. Story 15. Following their own interests and aims to conquer and partition the European part of Ottoman Turkey, the neighboring Balkan states, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, decided to start a war. The treaty between Serbia and Bulgaria, signed on March 12, 1912, with a secret annex, included a possibility for the transformation of Macedonia into an autonomous region and anticipated the arbitration of the Russian Tsar. In such form, this agreement was a compromise to avoid the territorial separation and partition of Macedonia. After Greece and Montenegro joined the agreement, a Balkan alliance was formed, and it immediately began preparations for a war against the Ottoman Empire. In autumn 1912, the Balkan allies declared war on Turkey. The offensive actions of the Balkan allies against the Turkish army were carried out mainly on Macedonian territory and on the Thracian front. Believing that this war would bring the long-expected freedom, the Macedonian people took active part in the First Balkan War with their own regiments and voluntary units. 44 such units were operating in Macedonia at the time, impeding the mobilization and the movement of the Turkish army with their diversions. About 14,000 Macedonians fought together with the Bulgarian army within the so-called Macedonian Regiment. At the same time, there were Macedonian soldiers distributed in 30 units within the National Defense and the voluntary regiments of the Serbian army. A similar formation, called the Holy Regiment, was operating within the Greek army. The victories of the Balkan allies over the Turkish army conditioned Turkey to sign a ceasefire and a short-term truce, but the battles went on until May 30th, 1913. Story 16, the Cathar Genocide and Albigensian Crusade. From about 1209 to 1229, the Catholic Church, under the reign of Pope Innocent III, had an entire military campaign to kill Cathars, a Gnostic sect of Christians mainly in the Languedoc of France at the time. These folks were normal people who espoused ideals like humility, not having children, not eating meat, loving your neighbor, and the coolest of the cool resolved themselves to abject poverty. They were the kinds of people who basically weren't hurting anybody. At the siege of Beziers in the summer of 1209, Arno Amalric led the army which stormed the streets, killing and pillaging. When asked how to determine Cathar from a Catholic, Arno said, "End them, for the Lord knows those that are his." Roughly 20,000 people perished that day, regardless of their religious affiliation. There are more stories like that, but that's the most famous of the bunch. Story 17, frankly, as an American, the Cold War. It's been long enough that we have the facts, both the heroic and the damning. But we're still living so deep in the shadow of McCarthyite paranoia and a sort of vague notion of the post-war boom as crystallization of manifest destiny that the Baudelarized CIA factbook version of events and a very limited tour of the fight for racial and gendered rights are almost all the average person seems to learn or retain about the period between 1900 and today. The entire world has a similar problem. Propaganda and media massages existed before World War I, but we had never before seen them, or the historically warping force of nationalism, taken hold of by the world's institutions to the degree it did between the last gasps of the old colonial 1800s and 1945. We're a world full of angry little people, full of manufactured histories to be proud of and manufactured grudges to be nursed. People really need to have more insight into the rise of the modern world if we want to survive in it and run it well, rather than just being fuel for a dirty, dying profit engine. Story 18, JFK's sister, Rosemary Kennedy, was lobotomized when she was 23 years old under her father's orders. He didn't even tell his wife until after the procedure was done, and the whole thing was kept secret for over 20 years from the rest of the family. She was awake during the lobotomy. The doctor made a hole in the front of her skull and started slicing off bits of brain tissue. The doctor asked her to count backwards or say the Lord's Prayer, and finally decided to stop slicing her brain when she became incoherent. This happened in 1941. She died in 2005. Story 19, Marx's life. That guy was awful, but far too many people think he was a saint. He lived from other people's money all of his life, including his mother and wife. He even scammed his uncle-in-law, the founder of Philips, telling him about a good business idea. As soon as he got the money, he spent it on 400 guns and one cannon he sent to the Belgian insurgency, an insurgency who never shrugged. But the worst part is when he and his wife had no money. Wolf, his friend, offered Marx to work as a teacher in his academy. Marx was a genius when it comes to learning languages. It took him 4 to 6 months to be fluent in Russian. But Marx refused. Instead, he sent his children to beg for money in the streets. Many of his children died of cold and starvation because he was too proud to work in his friend's academy. Story 20, experiments to test for surgeries, biological disease experiments, injecting prisoners with disease to study it. And one of the most sickening feeding radioactive food to mentally disabled children, inserting radium rods into the noses of school children, deliberately releasing radioactive chemicals over US and Canadian cities, measuring the health effects of radioactive fallout from nuclear bomb tests, injecting pregnant women and babies with radioactive chemicals, and irradiating the testicles of prison inmates, amongst other things, never taught in school as far as I know. Sure, many other countries did human experiments, some far worse, but these were done on unsuspecting disabled people or on just plain public. Don't forget the time when us military literally sprayed carcinogens directly on top of poor government housing. They were living in a housing provided by the government, but they did experiments on it. Many ex-residents died of cancer. Another one is false flag attacks that the government was willing to carry out in order to build public hate against the Cuban government to justify a full-scale war. The plans detailed in the document included the possible assassination of Cuban emigres, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating violent terrorism in U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by President JFK, thank God. Google Operation Northwoods for more info. Story 21. Two minor but interesting bits of history I always notice are blown out of proportion in U.S. high school history textbooks are the Alamo and the Battle of Saratoga. The Alamo has grown so large in American mythology that the rather insignificant battle, really it had almost zero impact on anything, often receives 2 or 3 pages of coverage in a textbook, often more than some really important stuff. The Battle of Saratoga is often described as the turning point of the Revolution in regards to the Northern Theater. However, at that point, due to losses of armaments and munitions, that were eventually used to drive the Brits out of Boston, in the raid on Fort Ticonderoga and the defeat of the British by Vermont, and mass militias that had just recently joined the Continental Army at the Battle of Bennington. The British Army was running on fumes, few supplies, many casualties, and declining morale. Saratoga is where they surrendered, but it is not where they were defeated. I attribute the highlight of these two battles in particular to be the result of both NY and Texas school boards selecting textbooks for the public school system. It motivates publishers to ramp up and highlight the importance of those states' activities beyond their actual story. Story 22. There are dozens of incredibly dark skeletons in our government's closet that have effectively been swept under the rug, out of sight, and out of the minds of the general public. The more important or scary M1's EMAO was Operation Northwoods. After Castro rose to power in Cuba, the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to persuade the Kennedy administration to allow the CIA to orchestrate and execute a series of large-scale terrorist attacks against the American public, then to attribute those attacks to Castro's regime in order to manipulate the American public into supporting a full-scale invasion of Cuba. As part of the false flag terrorism strategy, Operation Northwoods included a proposal to hijack large commercial airliners and crash them into large, crowded buildings. Unfortunately, Operation Northwoods is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to corruption and abuse of power in the American government. I swear, if our mainstream news media spent a few days adequately informing the American public about all the sketchy crap our government has been caught doing behind our back, all the contrived evil schemes they failed to cover up completely, conservatives and liberals would unite to overthrow our government in the blink of an eye. Alas, these days, the American MSM can only be depended on to pollute our minds and redirect our focus with distracting sensationalism about Donald Trump, the easiest target in the world for loud, shallow dissidents, and his endless stream of predictably detestable, yet largely irrelevant shenanigans. Now, Americans are effectively treating Trump or Russia as the end-all be-all of government corruption in America, and intellectual dissidents are casually dismissed as conspiracy theorists and Russian puppets by their peers. Story 23. Shortly after AIDS became known, there were concerns that the disease might be transmittable through blood and through receiving transfusions with contaminated blood from donors. Reagan's Secretary of Health, Margaret Heckler, lied to the American people and reassured them that the blood supply was perfectly safe. Truth was, at the time, they did not know whether or not AIDS could be transmitted that way.